Mithrandir we called him in elf fashion, said Faramir, and he was content. Many are my names in many countries, he said. Mithrandir among the elves, Tharkûn to the dwarves. Olórin I was in my youth in the west that is forgotten, in the south Incánus, in the north Gandalf. To the east I go not. The wizard Gandalf was a mysterious figure to almost everyone in Middle-earth, a wanderer who had dealings with elves, men, dwarves, and other figures like him who were just as mysterious. And through his time in Middle-earth, he was known by many names. Some of these are shared with us during the events of The Lord of the Rings, but one has an air of mystery about it. The name given to him in the south, Incánus, or Incánus. Here I will go over various names given to Gandalf before focusing on this particular name, and the apparent confusion surrounding its origin, its use, and where exactly this name could be found. By doing this, I may ruin the imaginative scenarios of Gandalf wandering in far and distant lands, and dealing with exotic peoples in his mission as one of the Istari. However, I will also be shining a light on Tolkien's love of languages, that names in his legendarium tend to mean something, and aid in creating its vast complexity and depth. It may be a surprise to no one that Tolkien, through his knowledge of languages, did not give Gandalf the name Gandalf through some forced manipulation of the name Gandalf itself. Grand Elf, for example. That would be stupid, wouldn't it? We are told in Tolkien's essay on the Istari that men of the north gave the wanderer the name Gandalf, as they deemed that he was of elven kind, journeying unwearyingly on foot and leaning on his staff. Gandalf means the elf of the wand. His presence, his nature, seemingly being foreign to the race of men, meant that he surely had to be an elf despite being elderly in appearance. They would have no clue as to his true origin as a Maya, for all intents and purposes what we would think of as an angel or messenger. Tolkien demonstrates the mysterious and unknown nature of this figure who had come to Middle-earth in the very real physical body of a man, just as the other wizards had. But like many names found in The Hobbit, where Gandalf first appeared, Gandalf is a name taken from Old Norse, specifically the first poem of the Poetic Edda, called Völuspá, prophecy of the Volva, or Cirrus. Many of the dwarf names used in The Hobbit are taken from the catalogue or tally of dwarves, and Gandalf's name is taken as well, as Gandalfr is a dwarf or Vergr in the Poetic Edda, and the name in Old Norse is a combination of magic staff and elf. As Gandalf in Tolkien's Legendarium is of course not a dwarf, the use of this name is tied to men of the north not understanding this being who worked wonders among them, delighting in the beauty of fire, performing marvels for mirth and delight. As the North constitutes most of the story within The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, this is the name we commonly read as some true name for this figure in Middle-earth, but it is one of many. When Faramir first speaks to Frodo about Gandalf, he mentions the Grey Pilgrim, and is asked if this figure had a name by Frodo. This is in fact a name, as Mithrandir is Sindarin for Grey Pilgrim or Grey Wanderer. Sindarin is the chief language of the elves dwelling in Middle-earth. A combination of myth, meaning grey, and Randir, which is a wanderer or pilgrim, both meaning someone who journeys. For those curious as to why Faramir would use the name Mithrandir and not Gandalf, this is because Faramir would speak Númenórean Sindarin, a dialect of Sindarin spoken by the Dúnedain in Middle-earth. By the time of The Lord of the Rings, Westron, the common speech of Middle-earth, was mainly used in Gondor, with Sindarin being a polite language used by those of a more pure Númenórean descent, like Faramir. Tharkûn is said to be used by the dwarves, though as is common with dwarves and their language Khuzdul, who exactly used this name for Gandalf is a bit of a mystery, as dwarves seemingly used the name Gandalf instead. This could, of course, be due to the name being created by Tolkien following The Hobbit, or Tharkûn just being translated for us in the Red Book of Westmarch. Still, an explanation could be that dwarves would use this as a private name with Gandalf or amongst themselves, a sign of his place amongst their people, and another example of their secret tongue not being spoken so openly by them. This is not confirmed anywhere and is just speculation. There is no other mystery surrounding this name, as among all the names given to this figure, Tharkûn is closest in meaning to Gandalf. It is typically translated as Staff Man, possibly meaning that Tharkûn was translated by dwarves from the name Gandalf into their tongue, though in this case he is referred to as a man. However, the name can also be translated as Staff One, or a description of Gandalf as one who carries a staff, not specifically referencing the figure as being of the race of men. Another fitting name alongside Gandalf and Mithrandir. Olórin seems to be the name of the being later known as Gandalf, as he was in the West, with Christopher Tolkien noting in Unfinished Tales that the mention of Olórin in the Valaquenta, written by his father and included in Christopher's edited Silmarillion, means that the Istari, the wizards, were Maiar, as Olórin was Gandalf. The West that is forgotten refers to the Undying Lands, a place that in the Third Age of Middle-earth would be unknown to the vast majority of its residents, reduced to myth or legend amongst those mortals imagining what lies beyond the Great Sea to the west of Middle-earth. The name Olórin is unclear in its full meaning, but is thought to derive from the Quenya Olór, meaning dream or vision. Quenya is more of a scholarly language of elves in the Third Age of Middle-earth, but is still spoken by the Noldor and many elves dwelling in the West, the high elven tongue beyond the sea. The name Olórin can be translated to mean dream or vision one. Its original form in The Lord of the Rings was Olórin, but was changed, and it has been suggested that Tolkien's original meaning for the name may have been Son of Dreams. Who would use this name? No one in Middle-earth that we know of. It's somewhat surprising that Gandalf would even reference it, as it directly points out that he comes from somewhere else, a foreign land, and those with wisdom may be able to interpret that. The likes of Saruman in private conversation with Gandalf may have used it, as he journeyed with him from across the sea before he was named Gandalf. But we can't know if Saruman would use this name, and that's just speculation. Saruman uses the name Gandalf during Gandalf's recollection of their meeting in Orthanc, but it is possible Gandalf would just omit that detail. In other versions of the story outlined in Unfinished Tales, Gandalf makes the same reference to that name concerning his role in the Quest of Erebor, and the victory for the West over Sauron and Minas Tirith, following the destruction of the One Ring. To do that, I used in my waking mind only such means as were allowed to me, doing what lay to my hand according to such reasons as I had. But what I knew in my heart, or knew before I stepped on these grey shores, that is another matter. Olórin I was in the West that is forgotten, and only to those who are there shall I speak openly. Other names we hear during the events of The Lord of the Rings are barely used, but still worth mentioning. Here you come again, and with you come evils worse than before, as might be expected. Why should I welcome you, Gandalf Stormcrow? Tell me that. Slowly he sat down again in his chair. King Théoden of Rohan calls Gandalf Stormcrow, a reference to Gandalf's appearances in Rohan in times of trouble. The name is almost certainly a reference to the association of crows with bad luck and bad omens, the storm being trouble on the horizon making its way to them. Lath spell I name you, ill news. And ill news is an ill guest, they say. This name is given to Gandalf by the treacherous Grima Wormtongue of Rohan, and he also gives us its meaning, ill news. This comes directly from the Old English for evil tale or ominous news. Grima echoes the words of the king by referencing Gandalf's time in Rohan as coinciding with periods of hardship. Here now I name my guest, Gandalf Greyhame, wisest of counsellors, most welcome of wanderers. Finally, the king of Rohan calls Gandalf Greyhame, a name in the tongue of Rohan called Rohanese. It is a modernised version of their word for grey coat or grey mantle. Rohanese is to Westron as Old English is to our modern English, and this is a reference to Gandalf's appearance. This brings me to the name Incánus. From discussions and exploring other people's views on this name over the years, I have found that it is common to use a definition for this name found in 1966, where we are told that this name is apparently alien, meaning it isn't Westron, Sindarin or Quenya, and from none of the surviving tongues of northern men. It is a form adapted to Quenya of a name used in the tongue of the Haradrim, meaning North Spy, possibly also being pronounced as Incánus. The Haradrim being the Southrons, men who serve Sauron from the south of Middle-earth and were long ago corrupted. This is interesting because it can tell us something about Gandalf's history in Middle-earth without going into any real detail. Unfinished Tales tells us that the main province of Gandalf was the North, specifically the northwestern areas of Lindon, Eriador, and the Vales of Anduin. He was close to Elrond of Rivendell and the Rangers of the North, and his wisdom had presaged the importance of hobbits. At this stage of writing, Gandalf was less concerned with areas of power, such as Gondor, as they already stood opposed to Sauron, and his threat could, for the time being, be resisted by armed force. He would only become concerned with such places when there was a decay in their power, as he could then guide and instruct, something he was unable to do while they still held power against Sauron and Mordor. To be called a North Spy indicates that men of the south opposed him in some way, and Harad and Sindarin does mean south. Gandalf then seems, if we care to speculate, like he had some part of his mission match that of the Blue Wizards who journeyed to the eastern regions, to Rhûn, in an attempt to sow discord among peoples who had long fallen under Sauron's sway, to those regions who viewed Sauron as a god king. Couldn't Gandalf in his earlier wanderings, before the threat of Sauron in the north of Middle-earth was at its peak, have wandered in these southern lands? With a name derived from an alien tongue of the Haradrim, it seems possible. Maybe realising that his efforts were best spent in the north, where Sauron would go to war, and rally his enemies over efforts to turn indoctrinated servants and slaves from the path their ancestors walked long before Gandalf walked in Middle-earth. The problem is that in 1967, a note provided a completely different meaning to this name. Instead of North Spy, it was said to be Mind Ruler, but not with negative connotations that may be interpreted from such a name, more akin to Gandalf being an authority of the mind. The etymology of Incánus changes from an alien language of the Haradrim to elements of the Quenya language, specifically In for mind and Can for ruler, also found in elements used to describe a ruler, governor, or chieftain, Cano and Canu. Christopher Tolkien even suggests that his father was influenced by the Latin word Incánus, meaning grey-haired, which is obviously fitting. Surprising to Christopher that Latin would directly be used in this way in the Legendarium, though Tolkien, as a devout Catholic, was familiar with and enjoyed Latin. Even Quenya seems similar to Latin in how it is used in the Legendarium, not being a dead language per se in Middle-earth, but a scholarly one, possibly explaining that this name for Gandalf had fallen out of use with those who may have called him it in earlier years, following his arrival in Middle-earth in the Third Age. Gandalf wouldn't have forgotten that it was a name he had been called. Still, Tolkien himself seemed to remark that this word for grey-haired in Latin and mind ruler in Quenya should be regarded as an accident, just as the tower used by Saruman the White in The Lord of the Rings, Orthanc, has multiple etymologies at work. For elves it can mean Mount Fang or Forked Height, but in Old English, which was used as the basis for Rohanese, used in Rohan as I described earlier, it means cunning mind, the translation of Saruman's own name in Middle-earth. Quite the accident. North Spy or Mind Ruler, who gave Gandalf the name Incánus? In Tolkien's Istari essay, Gandalf is said to have appeared to confine his journeys to western lands, inhabited by elves and the enemies of Sauron. He never journeyed east, but at any rate it seems unlikely that he ever journeyed or stayed long enough in the Harad, or Far Harad, to have there acquired a special name in any of the alien languages of those little-known regions. The south should thus mean Gondor, at its widest those lands under suzerainty of Gondor, at the height of its power. Tolkien decided that the south did not refer to, in this case, Harad or Far Harad, despite their literal translations. It referred to Gondor, perhaps at the time when its borders did stretch further south than we see during the events of The Lord of the Rings. But the name itself would be given to Gandalf by men of Gondor, and not the Haradrim, by allies and not enemies, and at a time when Quenya was a scholarly language of the learned, used in historical records, as had been the tradition since the days of Numenor. Tolkien concludes that Gandalf, if he had appeared around the year 1000 of the Third Age, may have visited Gondor enough times to acquire a name, perhaps during the reign of Atanatar al-Karin, 1800 years before the events of The Lord of the Rings, meaning by the time Faramir tells Frodo that Gandalf mentioned this name to him, it had long become obsolete, a relic of Gandalf's long stay in Middle-earth, known only to the learned men of Gondor, and not often shared beyond its rooms of dusty books and records. All of this means that it is entirely possible that an imagined backstory for Gandalf wandering the lands of the Haradrim unfortunately never happened, but instead, many visits to Gondor at a time when it had reached the height of its power and would begin its decline, its decay under the rule of Atanatar II, when the watch upon Mordor was neglected. A fitting time for Gandalf, Mithrandir, Tharkûn, Olórin, or Incánus to begin his mission proper, to stand as the enemy of Sauron in the Third Age. I want to thank those who continue to support this channel through YouTube or Patreon. I want to specifically give a shout out to those who support each and every month at the highest levels of membership: Patricia, Oliver, Virtutes, Moses, NCV and Seraphim. Your very generous support is much appreciated. Thank you.